So we turn today to Ian Dunt on politics.co.uk because, as I've said before, Ian Dunt is one of the few journalists out there who is really doing really good journalism on Brexit and covering just what a general disaster this is going to be. So straight away you can tell what his thoughts on the new white paper based on the Chequers Agreement is, and it basically sums it up in the headline. If this is all the government has for its Brexit white paper, we're in trouble. So obviously it's questionable how much input Dominic Raab had input into this white paper, bearing in mind he less than a week he'd been in the job when this paper came out, so yeah. So Ian begins. So that's it. After 2 years, the government finally publishes a Brexit white paper. It runs 104 pages, but it is so full of muddled thinking, desperation and fantasy that they could have done it in 5 and saved us all a lot of time. By the way, another point I want to bring this up. The white paper had been released the morning of the Thursday, and it had been in debate 4 hours before any other MPs actually got a hold of it. So this paper was being debated for 4 hours before any of the MPs could actually see it. So, yeah. So, anyway, he continues. So, to jumble up the Brexit jargon, it is cakeism minus. They have a cake, they have eaten it. Some of it's still magically on the plate, and the rest is being vomited up on the floor. At the heart of the Brexit white paper proposals, and the whole future relationship negotiation really, is a simple question. Who is in charge? The EU wants to remain the boss of how trade operates. The UK wants to have all the benefits of the trade, but also share management rights. It won't accept the consequences of taking back control. Theresa May has belatedly recognised the contradiction and accepted a common rulebook which would underpin the free trade area for goods. In reality, it is not a common rulebook at all. It is a European rulebook which the UK will follow. They go out of their way to pretend otherwise. The myth that this is some kind of partnership of equals features throughout the document, with constant references to how these plans would reassure the UK and the EU that goods in circulation in their respective markets meet the necessary regulatory requirements. This is all nonsense. What this amounts to is that we are accepting that the EU retains its boss status when it comes to goods. May hasn't signed up to the common rulebook on services, even though we're a service-based economy. Remember, 80% of our economy is based on services, and this is the trade we're most reliant on. But even here, the pretend language of equality is smeared all over the document. Take something called equivalence. This is a mechanism in which the EU uses something to say that a bit of a non-EU country's economy is up to roughly the same standards as its own, and they can therefore lower the barriers to trade. It has won with the US, for example, on use of clearing houses in derivatives trading. The trouble with equivalences is that it is completely unreliable. At any time, the EU can decide that it's going to take it away, and then within weeks the whole thing evaporates. That is not an acceptable status quo for a large modern economy. The white paper acknowledges this, saying that the existing equivalence regimes are not sufficient to deal with a third economy whose financial markets are deeply connected with the EU's. So, once again, you have the government basically saying, this is going to be a disaster. You know, we are so deeply connected to the EU, and we are so reliant on the EU, how are we going to run afterwards? But, This is the whole fantasy that Brexiteers love to spin, that we are somehow this amazing country. They vastly overestimate the UK economy. Where were we? Yeah, so it's deeply connected with the EU's. So they propose a bilateral mechanism to discuss changes in the rules with the expansion of existing autonomous frameworks for equivalence. In other words, cakeism. Autonomy and equivalence are at the same time mixed up with some magic new recipe they have not bothered to describe. Without any trade knowledge, you know that doesn't make any sense just by looking at the words. But the paper does not seem to have made any real progress in thinking through how these incompatible demands would operate in practice. It is not even really clear about what they hope to achieve by it. The government acknowledges that it can't have full passporting rights for financial firms, but doesn't state exactly what kind of rights it thinks it can secure. It then tries to smuggle some other bits of the single market into the agreement. This is what the EU calls cherry picking, and it is a fair description. In aviation, for example, where the UK has become a continental leader on the basis of the EU's liberal regime. It wants to maintain a reciprocal liberalised access, or in other words, to keep things exactly as they are right now. In energy, it holds open the possibility of staying in the internal energy market to preserve existing efficient trading practices. And the nuclear industry, it wants to close association with Euratom, the regulator, in a it foolishly left when it sent Article 50, the Article 50 letter. The presence of the equal relationship reaches unprecedented levels when it comes to the section on arbitration. The description of a joint body for settling disputes. They try to pretend this will be a new global political force, with the Prime Minister meeting EU figures banally to coordinate responses to new global crisis. But the real business of the thing will happen at the technical joint committees underneath it, which will discuss the new rules coming in and how they'll be implemented. The UK and the EU would notify each other through a joint committee of any proposal and adoptive legislation proposals, the paper insists. But in truth, this relationship will be one way, for it is as it is for countries like Switzerland or Norway, which also take on EU rules. Sure, they can wiggle around a bit on the technical level and the point of implementation, but no one pretends this is an equal relationship. Another section of this joint committee structure would deal with issues on equivalency. In both cases, it would set up new complex processes for what it would do as a rule goes against the agreement. Although it pretends this is also equal, and that there would be a discussion between the UK and EU about wherever the relevant rule change should be added to the agreement. In reality, it will not work this way. The EU will pass the rules and the UK will sign up to them. If they do not, there is an internal discussion about the joint committee ruling on whether it is within the scope of the agreement. Then a consolation, then the rebalancing measures, and a fine, in other words, and then finally, if all else fails, that part of the agreement would be suspended. Norway also has this power under Part 120 of the EEA agreement. It never uses it, the consequences are too stark, and that is because this is not an equal partnership. The EU is simply a bigger market than you. The attempt to ignore this fundamental truth is at the heart of most of the delusions in this paper. Sprinkled within the document are the occasional admissions of what the UK is signing up to. While the UK would not have a vote on relevant rule changes, it says its experts should be consulted. This is a very significant step down from the days where we actually formulated rules ourselves, but it also seeks to stay in several EU agencies on things like aviation, chemicals and medicines, but without voting rights. Where problems arise, the authorities of the report either refuse to acknowledge or they are unaware that they exist. The EU's existing free trade agreements with countries like Canada, for instance, are protected by the most favoured nation clause. This means that whatever they offer someone else a superior deal, they have to update it to make it just as good. A section in this white paper on mutual recognition for professional qualifications skirts over this without addressing it. The UK's agreements with the EU should not be constrained by existing EU FTA free trade precedents, it says. They do not recognise that this is precisely the problem. Anything offered to the UK must also be offered to Canada, South Korea, and others too. If they know this, they do not mention it, let alone try to grapple with it. Once we get to the section on the customs partnership, the white paper meanders off into the most tedious form of sci-fi possible. Long sections describe the tariff revenue formula of how the UK would impose EU tariff requirements at its border. They work out where products are going on the continent, either as a finished good or at the point at which the good is substantially transformed into a UK product. Good luck with that. Where the goods destination is the latter identified to be a lower tariff jurisdiction, the paper says, it will be eligible for a repayment from the UK government equal to the difference between the two tariffs. The sheer logistical complexity of this operation is beyond comprehension. The demand that it makes companies is similarly not worth talking about. And even if it wasn't, why would the EU trust a foreign power operating completely outside of its legal jurisdiction to take control of its tariff collections? What exactly do they gain for all the lost revenue and lack of control of it? What would that entail? It is never explained. But not content with applying one bonkers custom system, the paper goes ahead and insists another. It also calls the so-called max-fac model, favoured by Brexiteers, in which imaginary technical solutions are found to custom controls and applies them to the rest of the world. Quite quickly, this descends into badly written cyberpunk. This could include exploring how machine learning and artificial intelligence could allow traders to automate the collection and submission of data required for customs declarations. And it says at one point that if a civil servant writing it got bored and just thought they'd chuck as much crazy nonsense in as possible, they will need to phase an approach to implementation of this model. It says at the end, yes, indeed there will. One that lasts from now until whatever point in the future they invent this stuff. As a starting negotiation position, the Chequers statement was a real step forward. But to write it all down in a white paper, as if it were the finalised model, is fundamentally embarrassing. If the paper like this is going to be published, they should have done it just before they triggered Article 50. That was the right time for it. It is the kind of thing you would expect to read as an opening position statement, but it is not acceptable for this to be the height of their thinking now, with just weeks of negotiation time left. It skirts over issues it needs to address instead of grappling with them. It pretends to be describing a relationship of equals when it really is acknowledging that the EU will make the rules, and it is criminally vague and deluded on matters at which stage it should be dealt with and in specific and detailed terms. So that's the white paper, and it's comically bad, and as Ian Dunt puts it, the part about creating artificial intelligences that can somehow magically sort out the customs union, this technology does not exist. So he's right to point it out that they are describing some sort of sci-fi cyberpunk utopia Britain of technology that just doesn't exist. It's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable, the fact that they think they could just put that in there and just get away with it. Because they've been talking about, the Brexiteers have been talking about, oh, we can do this amazing technological solution. The technologies do not even exist. They do not even exist at like a prototyping level. So there is nothing that we could say, we're going to implement, oh dear, we're going to implement this. Oh, excuse me. But yeah, it's bonkers. It's insane. And Jesus Christ, we are so screwed. We are so screwed on so many fundamentals. And here's the thing, as he says at the end, they fully say multiple times in this paper without admitting it, look, the EU is going to make the rules because it is the bigger market. It has more power than us. And I've said many times before, all these Brexiteers have fallen into the Leave propaganda that somehow Britain is this secretly amazing economy that is being held back by the EU, and they are fundamentally overestimating our economy on a market times 100. Literally. I mean, as we just pointed out here, and I've pointed out constantly, look, our economy is 80% made up of services, and all those services predominantly go to Europe. The only trade agreement in this entire world that encompasses services is the single market and customs union. And yet, we, as a service-based economy, are going to leave that. So, there you go. You know, what more can you say about it than that? It's just absolute nonsense. Or to quote Ian Dunt, it's a cyberpunk fantasy. I mean, I couldn't believe it when they put, about, artificial intelligences. That was just unbelievable. But there you go. This is the level of thinking that these ideologues are at. Because remember, this was probably mostly written under David Davis's tenure. And as I've said before, all these hardcore Brexiteers are ideologically driven. They do not come from a place of actual factual reality.